Hello world, and welcome back to the Concerned Netizen channel at concernednetizen.com. I'm Clinton, and this is From Mallarmé to Mastodon. This is a very big episode for me because I'm actually going to be tying a whole bunch of McLuhan theory about 150 years worth of history all together to contextualize a breaking news story on the internet. Try to demonstrate the power of McLuhan in explaining our world today. I'm just going to dive straight into it. This is a news story from Tim Pool of Subverse.net. He was one of the founders of Vice News only a few years ago, and he's left that and is going independent now. He covered Occupy Wall Street, and now he has a YouTube channel. And we are going to jump into a fight that he is covering in the alternative tech social media world. So here he is. Let's
I have a feeling this video is going to get in trouble on YouTube because we're talking about adult content. Adult internet visual and content. And there's been this big debate going on. And the conservative free speech world is being torn asunder. Where conservatives, moral activists saying we must have a ban on adult content. I can't say the P word. It's censored here.
Interesting. Let's jump straight to Tim's take on this argument, and we'll get into the specifics of what world and what website and what censorship he's describing as this video progresses.
Okay. Enough flame war, guys. Let's talk about the real issue. First and foremost, adult content should not be banned. Sorry, but that is the correct response. Now, before all the conservatives who are on the side of Gab or, say, Matt Walsh freak out,
etc., etc., etc. All right, we won't waste any more time here because we have to get straight to the interior landscape. Yeah, that's the title of this book, by the way, The Interior Landscape. The Literary Criticism of Marshall McLuhan is the subtitle, just FYI. The world that this argument that he's making takes place in, that world was like 100 years ago. That world doesn't even exist anymore, and this argument that Tim is making here, with all due respect to him, makes no sense, and this whole flame war he's describing makes no sense. And here's why. On page 9, we are going to look of this book in an essay entitled Joyce, Mallarmé, and the Press. We are going to get a very fast recap of the history of how the new media creates the sort of conditions that people live in that shape their worldview. So 500 years ago, when everyone was writing things by hand, that was manuscript culture. And schoolrooms and places of learning where everyone sat together, slowly reading and writing their own textbooks together, were very communicative and involved. And the printing press changed everything. As McLuhan writes on page 9 here, if the manuscript tradition encouraged encyclopedism, that is, everyone getting involved and understanding all sorts of different topics, book culture naturally tended to specialism. There were enough books to make reading a full-time occupation and to ensure an entirely withdrawn and private existence for the whole class of bookmen. Eventually, there were enough books to splinter the reading public into dozens of non-communicating groups. That's been the last 500 years of Western culture. Wow. Europe simply being the, ground zero, the point of impact for a technology that changed the surrounding vicinity, right? This has meant a large degree of unawareness in our culture of the meaning and drift of its most obvious developments. So, obviously, this is a big story. I'm not about to tell the whole thing here. My last video on Siegfried Gideon in my OCAC series, you can go watch that to get another perspective on the past 500 years of history as told from a way that you might not have encountered it before. So that's what books did, is it totally fractured people. What's more interesting is what happened when the telegraph came in. because what the telegraph did was electrify the printing press. What you ended up with was the modern newspaper, as economist Harold Innis explains, as paraphrased by McLuhan. Innis has shown how the new global landscape of the press were not only geared to industry, but were themselves the means for paying for new roads, for railway and telegraph and cable. The physical landscape of the earth was changed very quickly by the landscapes of the newspaper, even though the political scene has not yet caught up. The networks of news, trade, and transport were one. So the telegraph basically started to take over the world around like 1850. And by 1880, the French poet Mallarmé, Stéphane Mallarmé, began writing poetry and whatnot around the newspaper, which was the brand new form that was basically changing the world. About 50, 60 years later, McLuhan cites in his book Typhon in America, the unpublished book, the writings of, rather I should say, the plays of playwright George Kelly, as explained by theater critic Mary McCarthy. Ms. McCarthy, in this review from 1947, explains George Kelly's plays. Here, let's see. It takes a second or third George Kelly play for the spectator to perceive, with the horror he remembers from dreams, that the stage business is everything. It's basically people standing around fiddling with their stuff and being awkward with each other and talking about absolutely nothing for the entire play. That's how she describes this guy's plays. The George Kelly play is in essence a long ad lib. Its subject is inanity. Stage time here, like lifetime, is an interminable gap which must be bridged by desperate conversational maneuvers, remarks about the weather, the time of day, vital statistics, golf scores, menus, clothes, train schedules, people's addresses. I don't know where all this rain is coming from. You can't tell. It might not be raining in Albany. Aren't those roses lovely? I heard her telling Miss Austin that she's got over 200 roses bushes in her garden. 2214. That must be out somewhere by the lake. I think there's nothing in the world as exhausting as train riding. Have you got the time? This gabble is the course which speaks the meaning of the play. And like a course as a pantomimic expression, a compulsive dance of pocketbooks, pencils, fancy work, glasses of water, hats, timetables, and newspapers. So these sound like really boring plays, right? What's going on behind the scenes? We see here on the left-hand page, there is not a play of George Kelly's in which the characters do not ask the time of each other, as though this knowledge were a pressing necessity. The passion for exact and irrelevant information is not a mere function of leisure here. The husbands as well as the servants participate in this acquisitive literalness. Regarding such boring conversation, this reply is somehow reassuring, and the question, prehensile, groping, has an anxious pathos. It is an attempt to possess a void. In the last plays of Kelly, the American family is seen as a nomadic integer, lost in time and space. Inquiring, placing, dating, its only impulse a locative one, its brain a rudimentary map on which, several times a day, through hearsay or direct information, new points are marked, new connecting lines traced between them. Next paragraph here on the next page. The sense of the American family as a floating, placeless in its solid living room, placeless in its solid living room, is intensified by the fact that the plays are set in no recognizable city, and yet always a different city, and so particularized that it cannot be every city. So the spectator's mind, the plays just sort of take place in this abstract dream world that isn't even grounded, it's nomadic, it's not even grounded in reality. It's literally the postmodern condition. how did this condition become about such that in the 1940s plays were being written about people lost in time who can't even talk to each other and are so socially awkward and anxious that they just chase after like random trivial facts, substituting precision for meaning or context, right? What the hell is going on? Well, that's what exploration of McLuhan is all about. That's the entire oeuvre of his work, is addressing this postmodern condition he was identified and was writing about in the 1940s, ameliorating it. And for him, it was the newspapers. At least it was in the beginning. It was the press at large, the media, the world at large. But the way he tells it, the way he understands it from the poetry of the French symbolist Mallarmé, he started off with the front page of the newspaper. This is his 1951 book, The Mechanical Bride, largely written in the late 1940s. First thing for analysis in The Mechanical Bride is the typical front page of a newspaper. In this case, the April 20th edition of the New York Times of 1950. So look, it's just a whole bunch of juxtaposed segments all together. Now, as a grammarian, McLuhan tried to find as many resonances, high and low, for as many analogies to tie meaning in the whole world together. And so, for him, this resonates a lot with the contemporary science of his time. As he writes, it is on its technical and mechanical side that the front page is linked to the techniques of modern science and art. Discontinuity is in different ways a basic concept both of quantum and relativity physics. It's the way a Toynbee looks at civilizations or the way Margaret Mead looks at human cultures. Notoriously, it is the visual technique of a Picasso or the literary technique of James Joyce. All right, we got Einstein's relativity, we got quantum physics, Picasso, James Joyce, all as discontinuity. Right? What is discontinuity? It's the lack of connection between all the shards and fragments of meaning that don't add up to anything, just like all of the juxtaposed stories in a newspaper that sit side by side but have nothing to do with one another. This is what a lot of Mallarmé's poetry was about. That huge landscape of the human family, which is achieved by simply setting side by side disconnected items from China to Peru, presents a daily image both of the complexity and similarity of human affairs, which, in its total effect, is tending to abolish any provincial outlook. McLuhan's, of course, famous for the phrase global village. This is what he means. When you have just snippets of the whole world all together, that don't have any related meaning, you end up filling in the meaning as something deep. Let's go back to the essay Joyce Mallarmé in the Press, which is reprinted in the Interior Landscape here. Mallarmé sees this impersonal art of this is page 16. Mallarmé sees this impersonal art of juxtaposition as revolutionary and democratic in the sense that it enables each reader to be an artist. Quoting Mallarmé, quote, "Reading becomes a solitary, tacit concert given to itself by the mind, which recaptures significance from the least sonorities." End quote. So all the elements in a newspaper, they're not completely unrelated. There is sonorities, there are resonances between them, but the weaker those resonances are, the more you have to become an artist to see what's in common between them. And of course, what's in common between fragments of stories of human life all around the world is only the human condition and the human nature at large in all of its possible myriad diversity and complexity. Continuing back to McLuhan, he continues, "It is the rhyming and orchestrating of things themselves which releases the maximum intelligibility and attunes the ears of men once more to the music of the spheres. We are finished," Mallarmé says, "with that custom of an official literary decorum by which poets sang in chorus, obliterating with their personal forgeries the actual signatures of things. In fact, the new poet will take just as much care to avoid a style that is not in things themselves as literary men have in the past sought to achieve and impose one. So, 500 years ago, the printing press brings out the literary man who forges a signature on the whole of the world, right? Each person gives their own take on everything that's going on. And the newspaper, the Telegraph, comes along and creates the newspaper with, which is just like a screen today. It's like the newspaper of the 1880s or the 1940s was about as technically complex as the phone in your hand, insofar as the global communication network that brought all this information together every day. It's just the electronics in a newspaper are in the publishing office. They're not actually in the newspaper. That doesn't mean a newspaper is not very much an electric medium. You got to remember that. The actual signature of things in themselves comes through all these stories, as exemplified by the New York Times. Now, right, the person has to get deep into the world to actually imagine one world where all of these different, apparently superficially unrelated stories can all happen together, and you get deeper to, the music of the spheres, he writes. Now, of course, there are complications. Mallarmé was describing the 1880s, and McLuhan here uses the New York Times as an example of the survival of that heritage into the 1950s. We flip to the next item for analysis. It's this newspaper here, the Journal American, which was a newspaper from the Hearst Press of William Randolph Hearst. So, as compared with the New York Times, McLuhan writes, note the use of headlines in the Hearst Press to build the news of the day into a personal drama. Note how items provide a sort of X-ray drama of the common passions of the human heart. It was seen in the last article in the New York Times that the real tendency of disconnected news items assembled from all over the world and placed side by side was to evoke the image of a world society. The Hearst Press, and as we shall see, Time and Life magazine, tried to resist this tendency by swamping, with a flood of superimposed emotion, the emergent image of the world as one city. So when we get news, information from all over the world, the whole world grows together. Yellow journalism creates a swamp of emotion, and that floods out that neutral juxtaposition of reports. Now, the Hearst Press, that was newspapers every day, right? When it comes to magazines, think about how a magazine is different from a newspaper. It's weekly, and it's not a whole bunch of things juxtaposed all together. It's a continual story from side by side. That's what brings us to the third entry in The Mechanical Bride, the Ballet Luce, which is named after Henry Luce, who was, of course, the creator of Time and Life and Fortune magazines. Now, what I'm about to read you is just a little snippet. You can go find an essay by McLuhan called The Psychopathology of Time, Life, and Fortune online, which goes far deeper into his thoughts on the Luce Press. Suffice it to say, once you get to magazines as a mass medium, we can read... Time magazine, however, is an important factor in contemporary society. Its shape and technique constitute a most influential set of attitudes which are effective precisely because they are not obviously attached to any explicit doctrines or opinions. Like the clever ads, they don't argue with their readers. They wallop the subconscious. Instead, it has already been suggested that the overall effect of the press today has been developed an image of the world as a single city. This effect is not intentional. It's the byproduct of sheer techniques of news gathering and presentation. Less crudely than the Hearst Press, for example, Time resists this anonymous and impersonal tendency of the communication techniques of our day. Time is a resistance to giving people scattered fragments of the whole world for them to perceive, try and create an understanding of the whole world from. Time is nothing if not personal. Consider the old Time boast, quote, as if by one man for one man, end quote. It's like that was like a tagline to sell Time magazine at one point. Does this suggest a highly colored and selective approach? A strong tinge of the totalitarian in the formula? Surely it is not the formula for a world society, but for clique control and indoctrination. How does it do this? With a sadomasochistic mechanism of punch and get punched, which we found everywhere from the society gossip columns to the kids' comics. Inevitably, it depends on readers and entertainers who are sunk into a sub-rational trance. Such patterns can only persist in a dream state of some sort. So it's pretty heavy criticism of the contemporary press, and yet I'm sure you can see how that resonates with arguments today about algorithms and echo chambers and overtone windows and whatnot. Well, think about let's be specific. The sadomasochistic mechanism of the punch and get punched, from society gossip columns of Winchell to the kids' comics. Holding up real three-dimensional actual living beings as simple two-dimensional cartoon-like caricatures to be mobbed on social media or made fun of on a late-night comedy program, or to be that is the modus operandi of contemporary yellow journalism, right? The political meaning of time, style, and technique are made fully explicit in the following words from a biography of one of the founders of Time. Time, quote, by treating events as though seen by the same person, made them into a continued story. Instead of resembling a ragged mob shuffling down the side street of perception, the march of events became a glittering parade with flags waving, bands playing, and the ranks keeping step. Back to McLuhan. If a goose-stepping reader could be persuaded to dwell on that passage in connecting with Time, he would learn more than there is space here to comment on. But note the continued story technique of the 19th century in Hearst journalism, deliberately receding from the spontaneous cubism achieved in the New York Times front page. Again, in place of the simultaneous and multiple vision of the front page, which provides a bird's eye view, see Time magazines as though seen by the same person. Like the editorial policy and the shaping of its contents, which amounts to a breathless outpourings of a private diary. He goes on to reference more and more of the totalitarianism behind trying to take the news coming from the global village and shape it into one singular narrative. So, that was the 1940s. This book came out in 1951, and these arguments that he's laying out here, in terms which are unfamiliar but very relatable, actually still make up the very arguments that everyone seems to be having today about social media and modern press and the news and fake news and cable television and you got to realize that in McLuhan's terms, that's the rear view mirror. Again, the fight that's going on was relevant to the 1940s. It's not at all relevant anymore, and that's because you have to understand the complete change in mediums underlying the substance of our press. So, if you've read Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks, he sort of goes through this whole idea of how philosophy from Kant to Hegel through to Marx all takes place in this idea that people live only in their subjective minds and we're all broken off from the objective world. You can see here how McLuhan conceptualizes cubism as an example of the sort of multi-leveled, multi-perspectival thinking that facilitates getting closer to the substance of objectivity than is allowed by this postmodern objectivity is dead sensibility. He gets into this a lot more back in the essay. Let's just go back to the essay that we're talking about. He talks about precisely this in very coded, strange terms, which as weird as they are, ought to even provide more context. Page 12 of The Interior Landscape. For that school of thought, for which the external world is an opaque prison, art can never be regarded as a source of knowledge, but only as a moral discipline and a study of endurance. The artist is not a reader of radiant signatures on materia signata, but the signer of a forged check on our hopes and sympathies. This school has supported the idea of the function of art as catharsis, which, as G.R. Levy shows in The Gate of Horn, was a preparation for the lesser Greek mysteries. The mystery schools of ancient Greece? What the hell is McLuhan getting at here? But the world is not opaque, and if the mind is not of the earthy, then this moral view of art should yield to the cognitive view. However that may be, the cathartic, ethical view of art has led to a doctrinaire hostility to the use of discontinuity in the art, and indifference to all popular art. Indifference to popular art. Okay, so let's take the bits of what he's saying here and try to put it together. There's an ethical view of art by people who view the external world as an opaque prison by which the function of art is to, by catharsis, lead people through some sort of initiatory rite into becoming moral people for their own good, by selling them forged checks on the substance of reality. In this past century, with every technological device advancing the discontinuous character of communication, the stand taken by the cathartic and ethical school has enveloped the entire world of popular culture in a haze of esoteric nescience, disguised, however, as a profound moral concern with the wider hope and the higher things. So, avoid all the trash, just look at all the higher things and aspire to become a more ethical person by only looking upon art which properly trains you to be the right moral sort of person. Avoid the massive democratization and the discontinuity of the fullness of everything happening in the world, including the low and the vulgar. Don't pay any attention to the low and the vulgar. Become initiated and through the draw of the catharsis, your emotional release of staying within your own private echo chamber full of which already feeds your own biases. For example, you notice how he's describing things that everyone's arguing about today, but in terms that are completely foreign. That is a result of what he's trying to demonstrate as the cubist perspective of being able to use analogy and allegory to describe things in completely different terms. You have to be able to read McLuhan and then see how he's describing something very relevant going on in your life. But again, understanding of the medium, the technology, is crucial. And that's what the rest of this video is about. Because we're not living in a world where we're fighting against, William Randolph Hearst and Henry Luce and their proclivity to bias our news and keep people in their own little filter bubbles and echo chambers, because that was only possible when the electronics behind gathering the communication and presenting the worldview were located and monopolized within the telegraph offices and the radio offices that were, services offered to the newspaper publishers, right? All of those technologies are now actually embedded in your personal private property, your phone, your microcomputer. So the complete landscape has changed. Which gets us to the story of microcomputers. I got a whole documentary series on it you can watch on my YouTube channel. You can find it on my website, concernednetizen.com, called Silicon and Charybdis. And It's kind of in short, it's the story of how, to use Siegfried Gideon's term, the ruling taste or the market demanded easy-to-use computers that aren't don't present themselves as programmable, but present themselves as the old media, the old newspaper in a new form, right? Which is why you have newspapers on your phone and magazines on your phone and front pages on your phone, and you don't actually sit around programming your phone every day like you could be in a world where the market didn't demand that nobody understand computers in order to own and use and operate a computer. That's kind of how we got into this strange place where the arguments about reality don't make sense anymore. So let's go back to Tim Pool, because what he's arguing about is censorship on this alt-tech platform called Gab. Okay, what the heck is Gab? A few years ago, when Twitter and Facebook and Reddit started clamping down on hate speech, free speech activists started sprawling out to try to create their own new platforms that were free speech oriented, and lots of mostly right-wing people moved off of the main centralized platforms onto these platforms, and a major one is Gab. So here's my Gab account, full of ridiculously inflammatory, controversial stuff that nevertheless there are enough people in the world reading that it's worth understanding if you're a grown-up and not some young developing mind, right? If you're actually responsible enough to be able to like handle things that are politically incorrect, then you can go to Gab and find all the shit that children are being protected from, right? Stuff that used to be all over Twitter and Facebook but have now been taken away. So something happened a few years ago, and that is this. Mastodon came out as a replacement for Twitter. And what's Mastodon? Mastodon is software that emulates Twitter. It's based on a distributed protocol that uses something you may have heard of called the internetworking faculty of the TCP/IP stack and internet domain names. In the 70s, they created this thing called internetworking, which allowed different computer networks to all be internetworked. So each network got its own domain name, like harvard.edu. In the 90s, they released a domain name for commercial services called .com. So if you get a domain name for your private network can talk to all the other different private networks, regardless of what operating system you're running on your network, whatever network you're running privately. If you get a domain name and an IP address, then your computer network can talk to all the other. There's this wonderful invention called internetworking. So on Twitter, you send someone a tweet by @ing them. You type the @ symbol on your keyboard if you want to talk to Jack, I think, the guy, the founder of Twitter. You type @Jack. Hey, you made Twitter, right? Well, in the 70s, they invented this thing called electronic mail or email. And with email, I know you might not have heard of it, you use someone's username and then you type the domain of their internetworked network to send mail to someone with that username at that network. So if you want to send, Professor Oblivion, who works at Harvard, an email, you would be like, poblivion at harvard.edu, and you can send an email to that user of that network, the Harvard campus computer network, right? That's how internetworking brings all the different private networks of the world together. So what Mastodon does is it lets you do that for Twitter. Anyone can buy a web server and run their own little Twitter on their own domain name, like say, here's the main Mastodon instance at mastodon.social. And you see here, they got a whole bunch of usernames, just like you have on Twitter, except look at this one, LibreOffice at fostodon.com. Well, what the heck is fostodon.com? Let's find out. Fostodon.com. Oops, I can't spell. It's obviously Mastodon. Yeah. Oh, it's another Mastodon instance. Let's see what's happening. Let's go to the front page of Mastodon.com. Oh, look. It's another Mastodon instance. Look, there are thousands of Mastodon instances out there, but they can all talk to each other because you can talk to users on other instances by sticking the domain name on their end, just like an email address. This is the Fediverse, a federation of social networking, which is ridiculous because it's so simple, it's so easy to use, and yet also completely revolutionary. And so Gab, this right-wing Twitter clone, free speech Twitter clone, launched, and then a few months ago, you see here, it became the largest, it converted its underlying source code to become a Mastodon instance, and all at once totally became the largest Mastodon instance in the whole Fediverse. So all of a sudden, Gab joined this giant world of all these different internetworked Twitters, which can all talk to each other, and flooded the Fediverse with a bunch of right-wing conspiracy theorists, but not, and free speech activists, and libertarians, and disillusioned liberals, and the whole panoply of people who, for various reasons, no matter what they don't get along with, they all felt as though social media and the news was leaving out too much of the world because of its biased yellow, world truncating journalism of the sort that McLuhan is here ascribing to Time magazine and the Hearst press back in the 1940s. That they all jumped ship to Gab and to Mastodon. So if we actually check out what happened next, you see here that the Mastodon project immediately disowned Gab. Mastodon is completely opposed to Gab's project and philosophy, which seeks to monetize and platform racist content while hiding behind the banner of free speech. We're going to stand up to hate speech. That's perfectly fine. And nobody, honestly, nobody wants to scroll through a whole bunch of crazy right-wing stuff on their front page if they don't have to, right? Now, who would want to? It would be someone who wanted to actually keep tabs on what's going on, but you would want it to be someone who's mature enough to, have the composure to see different worldviews without, not children, obviously, right? People who aren't immature. Anyway, so when everyone was championing Mastodon, saying, "Hey, this is great. We've got this alternative platform to Twitter where you're in control and you can choose which group to join," everyone was talking about how great it was, and then Gab joined, and now all of a sudden it's like, oh my god, wait a minute, we didn't want to tie together all the world if it's going to have hate speech on it. And now, as we see the conservative, as Tim Pool's talking about, now on the flip side, Gab doesn't want any pornography on their platform, and the libertarians are freaking out, saying, "Hey, I thought this was supposed to be free speech." But what everyone's missing is that the whole point of Mastodon to begin with is that you can choose what communities you join and what communities that you follow, and you are put back into the control of shaping your worldview. And so you can not have to rely on Twitter to filter stuff out. In fact, it's impossible to filter stuff out because in Gab, if you wanted to, even though they ban porn, you could go find some Mastodon server dedicated to porn and you could follow it on your own right from within Gab. You can fill your timeline full of stuff from other websites. And so the entire argument doesn't make sense because it is decentralized right back to the way the web was decentralized to begin with. Yeah, sorry, I'm still trying to just figure out how to dial back from how ridiculously simple that situation is. When the internet, when I was starting on the internet in, let's say, the early 2000s, which is late to the game, I was just a kid. I was reading, say, Fark.com, which is a news aggregator, which sort of like the New York Times, they presented a headline of conservative headlines, right-wing headlines. As long as they were funny, they were all mashed together, and you couldn't tell which was which if you didn't have political sensibilities, right? And there's a constant, or because this came out of America, there's a constant citing of a quote. I disapprove of what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Now, that's a quote by a woman named Beatrice Evelyn Hall, which has for years been misascribed to Voltaire, but it was by Beatrice Evelyn Hall. And that has been the tagline of the internet for so long that it was inevitable that attempts to regulate modern mass media online was going to utterly fracture and splinter the social media world. Here's where we get to an announcement that came out very recently. Jack, the owner of Twitter, said on the 11th of December, today being the 13th, Twitter is funding a small group to come up of 5 open source architects, engineers, and designers to develop an open and decentralized standard for social media. The goal is for Twitter to become a client of this standard. Oh, so he's going to do what Gab just did, except he's going to bring Twitter in to swamp the Fediverse, right? Look at the responses here. We've got, for crying out loud, Matrix, which is an open source federated platform for communication, says, don't reinvent the wheel. So, Mastodon project, which already exists. Look, Twitter's reinventing the wheel. If Jack is going to turn Twitter into a Mastodon instance, I'm fine with that. More opinions. This protocol already exists. It's called ActivityPub, which underlies Mastodon. So, you're reinventing the Mastodon project? Again, we are going through really obvious moves, which if you understand the technological terrain, if you understand what internetworking is, then you see how the centralized control which used to exist in a publisher's office is now totally gone. And the platforms that people are jumping to, whether or not Twitter just joins Mastodon or whether they try to create their own competing alternative protocol, the power is ultimately in the hands of anybody who educates themselves well enough to join a different social network. If you go to Mastodon.com right now, you can find they have a curated list of many different Mastodon instances that you can join. You can see the sort of topics related to things that you can follow, right? And there are many such sites which will show you many such instances. Like the whole internet outside of social media has been there for a very long time, waiting for you to dive in. But if we go back to what McLuhan was saying here in the literary criticism of McLuhan, in the interior landscape, you can see the immense, ridiculous risks that people are undertaking by diving into a world which might be something approaching a global village, where you're taking fractions of the whole world and placing them side by side and trying to get a cubist view of what's going on. Which, I mean, I think John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis web series is an attempt to try and foster wisdom and maturity in grappling with the sort of problems at this scale which the electronic condition has thrust into all of us. McLuhan tried to grapple, his whole life's work is an attempt to grapple with the difficulties of managing a world abundant in information. But when people are free to jump onto the internet and shape their own front page and shape their own total worldview, then they are subject to capture by world-making artists who can provide them with the cathartic release and the semblance of a worldview that seems to be total, but in fact is precisely these initiations into a total belief system with its own Overton window and its own us versus them, all and its own tribalisms, and that is the contemporary environment that we have to see it for what it is. Because I mean, if you were to just join Gab and only trust them, I mean, look at these names and these headlines. It's largely, if you were to just trust the user group of this one Mastodon instance to shape your worldview, you're going to become a right-wing extremist really freaking fast. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that everyone in the room who wants to see what the hell's going on in the world and predict events ought to ignore or try to filter out and block all acknowledgement of what conversation is going on in those realms, and vice versa. Trying to understand, honestly, like, if you want to, like, the political left is all about postmodernism and explaining the very conditions brought on, according to McLuhan, by the electronic environment that was going on in that George Kelly play, and trying to understand how many people's worlds are built of social constructs and how they are, in fact, the very subjects, these Kantian, Hegelian subjects, divorced from, like, the postmodern condition is very real, and the drives to, and all of the discussions around that, which come out of the academic postmodern left from French theorists, is you really do actually have to understand that, because they are describing a real true phenomenon, and it is an earnest effort to make sense of it. So to just dismiss the entire postmodern discussion as like insane or obscure or whatnot is equally as asinine, right? Like, nobody said making sense of the world was easy. So I think that about suffices for our journey from Mallarmé to Mastodon. The front page of the newspaper is art, unintentionally, when it's just fragments of the world all thrown together. But as soon as that art becomes intentional, it becomes a filter bubble, it becomes a specific created worldview, it becomes a forged check on the signature of reality. And now the power is in your hands to recreate a multi-perspectival view. You can create on your phone a window if you subscribe to many different feeds, and you keep mixing it up and you explore different contrasting incompatible areas with fewer and fewer obvious sonorities. Then you can try to bring yourself deeper into something which captures the total human condition and total human nature. And or you can fall prey and fall victim to initiation into somebody else's yellow journalism, or worse. If you want to explore more about any of these topics, I've got links down below. A really good idea would be to go support the McLuhan Institute. Andrew McLuhan's endeavor to spread the work of Eric and Marshall McLuhan, because there's so much more where this came from. It's really worth diving in, and it's a lot to read. You can find him at patreon.com/McLuhan. My site, concernednetizen.com. You can support me at patreon.com/ClintonTheGeek. I'm going to keep pumping out content. Subscribe, like, share, all that stuff. And thanks for listening. Let me know what you think. And until next time, take care out there in the post-centralized media foam.